My name is Lily Kensington. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as someone reliable, steady, and quietly capable. I work in operations management, one of those roles where you're expected to anticipate problems before they become visible, to smooth chaos without ever being seen as the source of stability. It's the kind of job that rewards silence, patience, and emotional restraint. People usually describe me as strong, but what they often mean is undemanding. I don't ask twice, I don't make scenes, I don't collapse publicly when things hurt. And because of that, people assume I'm fine, even when I'm not, especially when I'm not. This story isn't about betrayal in the way movies like to tell it. There are no screaming matches, no shocking twists revealed in a single moment. What happened to me unfolded quietly over time in rooms where no one raised their voice and nothing technically went wrong. And yet something essential was lost. I was married to a man who promised to support me during IVF treatment. Not in vague terms, not someday. Specifically, consistently, emotionally, physically present. He said he would show up, he said we were a team, and then, slowly, predictably, he didn't. What I want to be very clear about from the beginning is this. This is not a revenge story. I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I'm not interested in assigning villains or rewriting the past to make myself look heroic. I'm telling this story because there's a kind of pain that doesn't leave bruises, doesn't provoke arguments, and doesn't give you the dignity of clear rejection. Absence hurts more than rejection. Rejection, at least, acknowledges your presence. Absence teaches you that your pain can be scheduled around, deferred, forgotten. This story follows an emotional journey rather than a dramatic one. It's about how someone learns, very slowly, that being understood in theory is not the same as being supported in reality. It's about how silence can start as endurance and eventually become a decision. And it's about how people often only recognize what you meant to them after you stop compensating for their absence. I won't exaggerate timelines or heighten moments for effect. IVF is already an emotionally demanding process. It doesn't need embellishment. What I can promise is honesty about what it feels like to sit alone in a waiting room you were supposed to enter together, and to realize that the person who said they would be there believes their intention should count as presence. If you've ever been the one who carried the emotional weight quietly, who didn't want to burden others with what you were going through, or who learned that being low maintenance often comes at a cost, this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. So before I continue, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever stayed quiet, not because you were strong, but because you weren't sure anyone would notice if you spoke? To most people, I was easy to define. I was the reasonable one, the calm one, the one who didn't complicate things. In our marriage, I was often described, by my husband, by friends, even by family, as low maintenance. It was said like a compliment, like something rare and valuable. I wore that label carefully, the way you wear something handed to you without checking whether it actually fits. I handled logistics without being asked. I remembered appointments, birthdays, deadlines. I planned meals around his schedule. I adjusted my own needs so they wouldn't interrupt his momentum. None of this felt like a sacrifice at the time. It felt like adulthood, partnership, love expressed through efficiency. When we decided to pursue IVF, everyone remarked on how strong I was about it, how composed, how practical. I did the research, booked the consultations, tracked the medications, and understood the statistics. Nurses spoke to me like I was a colleague. Doctors explained things quickly, assuming I could keep up. And I could. What no one seemed to notice was how alone that competence made me. My husband trusted me to handle the process, not because he didn't care, but because he believed caring meant believing I had it under control. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't sit beside me during the research spirals late at night. He told people he was supportive, and in his mind, that was true. Support to him was approval without interruption. I became invisible in a very specific way. Not ignored, not dismissed, just assumed. My presence was so consistent that it stopped registering. Like background noise, you only notice when it disappears. Friends would ask how IVF was going and then pivot quickly, uncomfortable with the topic. Family members praised my resilience. "You're so strong, Misties," they said. "You're handling this so well." No one asked who was handling me, and I didn't correct them. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't come from being unseen, but from being seen only as a function, the organizer, the absorber, the stable surface everyone leans on without wondering what supports it underneath. That was who I was to them. I wasn't dramatic enough to worry about, not fragile enough to check on, not loud enough to interrupt. Even in moments when I tried, gently, to express vulnerability, it was often reframed. "You're just tired. This is a stressful process. You're doing great, though." The conversation would end there, neat and contained, as if acknowledging the strain was enough to relieve it. Inside, something quieter was happening. I was learning how easy it is to disappear while still being physically present, how being dependable can slowly turn into being expected, how love, when paired with comfort, can drift into assumption. I don't say this with bitterness. I didn't feel angry then. I felt responsible. Responsible for keeping things smooth. Responsible for not making a hard process harder. Responsible for maintaining emotional efficiency. I told myself that this was just a phase, that once the treatment stabilized, once the uncertainty passed, things would rebalance. I believed patience was a form of strength. I believed endurance would be noticed eventually. What I didn't understand yet was this. People rarely notice what you absorb for them. They only notice what you stop absorbing. At that stage, I was still fully present, still reliable, still quietly holding the weight without asking who else might carry it with me. I didn't see myself as invisible. I saw myself as necessary. And necessity can feel a lot like love until the day it doesn't. At the beginning of this story, I was not a woman on the edge. I was composed, engaged, doing what needed to be done. I was exactly who everyone thought I was. The problem was that no one was asking who I needed to be. The first time he didn't show up, it didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like a misunderstanding. We had talked about the appointment days earlier. I had written it in our shared calendar. He had nodded while I explained what the consultation would involve. Blood work, timelines, and next steps. Nothing dramatic. Just one of those early IVF appointments where everything is still theoretical, where hope hasn't yet learned how fragile it is. That morning, I woke up early, as usual. I moved quietly through the apartment, making coffee, checking my bag, reviewing notes I had already memorized. He was still half asleep when I reminded him what time we needed to leave. He said, "I might be a little late today. Work's been unpredictable." He said it casually, not apologetically, not dismissively either, just as a statement of fact. I told myself it was fine. We could meet there. It wasn't a major appointment. The words came out of my mouth smoothly, practiced before I realized I had rehearsed them at all. At the clinic, I sat in the waiting room surrounded by couples. Some were quiet, some whispered. Some held hands with the kind of intensity that comes from standing at the edge of something unknown together. I checked my phone once, then again. No message. I watched the door more than I needed to. Not anxiously, just enough to register absence. When my name was called, I stood automatically, like this was how it was supposed to go. During the appointment, the nurse asked a question meant for both of us. "Do you have support at home during the stimulation phase?" I answered without pausing. Yes. It was true, technically. He was supportive in theory. He believed in the process. He wanted a child. He just wasn't in that room. When I got home later, he asked how it went. I gave him the short version. Facts, numbers, next steps. I didn't mention the empty chair beside me or the way the doctor glanced at it once before continuing. He said, "I'm glad it went smoothly." That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement that he hadn't been there. No curiosity about how it felt. I noticed the absence of those things, but I didn't name it. Naming it would have made it real, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I said, It was just one appointment. He had work. This process is long. We can't both be present for everything. Those thoughts felt reasonable. Mature. Fair. But something subtle had shifted. I began to track his presence without meaning to. Not in a resentful way. More like an internal data collection. Who shows up? When? How consistently? I didn't confront him. I didn't even feel angry. I felt alert. The second small cut came weeks later. Another appointment. Another conversation where he said, "Remind me," and then forgot. This time he texted halfway through. "Running late. You're good, right?" I stared at that message longer than necessary. You're good, right? It wasn't a question about how I felt. It was a request for reassurance that his absence wouldn't create consequences. For him, I replied, "It's fine." And again, it was until it wasn't. The thing about small cuts is that they don't bleed much. They don't demand attention. They don't give you a clear reason to stop what you're doing and reassess the entire structure of your life. They just sting quietly. Everyone else ignored these moments. Friends assumed we were navigating IVF together. Family asked how you two were holding up. No one questioned his absence because I never framed it as an absence. I framed it as logistics. I was still protecting the story of us as a team, even as the evidence began to suggest otherwise. I told myself not to overreact. I told myself this wasn't rejection. That would come with words, with conflict, with clarity. What I didn't understand yet was that absence doesn't announce itself. It just starts showing up consistently until you're the only one still arriving. And once you notice that pattern, you can't unsee it. By the time I noticed the pattern, it already had a rhythm. Not dramatic enough to confront, not blatant enough to accuse, just consistent enough to adjust around. IVF is a process built on schedules, medication windows, monitoring appointments, and lab results that arrive without ceremony. My husband's absence began to fold itself neatly into that structure. He wasn't there. He just wasn't there when it mattered most to me. And because I was still functioning, still composed, still managing the logistics, his absence became manageable. I started booking appointments without asking if he could come. It felt efficient. I stopped mentioning times unless they required his physical presence. When nurses asked if my partner would be joining, I answered smoothly, he couldn't make it today, as if that was the most natural thing in the world. What I didn't say was how automatic that sentence had become. At home, I updated him on summaries, bullet points instead of feelings. He listened in the way people listen when they trust the outcome more than the process. He believed I would tell him if something was wrong. I didn't, because I wasn't sure it was wrong yet. There's a strange kind of self-discipline that develops when you don't want to appear needy. You learn to compress your emotions, to edit your experiences before sharing them, to tell yourself that wanting more support is the same as being unreasonable. I told myself he loved me. I told myself he was stressed. I told myself this was temporary. I also told myself that if I needed him, I would ask. That belief became my justification. The problem was that asking had started to feel like asking for something that should already be offered. And once that line is crossed, silence becomes easier than articulation. So I adapted. I learned which appointments would leave me emotionally raw and scheduled them early, before work, before the day had time to collect weight. I learned how to drive home afterward without music, how to sit in the car for a few extra minutes to let the feeling pass before walking into the apartment. When side effects intensified, I downplayed them. When anxiety spiked, I managed it quietly. When disappointment arrived, I processed it alone, efficiently, like a task that needed completion. From the outside, I was handling IVF exceptionally well. Inside, I was learning how to be alone while married. And no one challenged this dynamic because it worked. It worked for him. He didn't have to rearrange his life. It worked for friends and family who could admire my strength without sitting with my vulnerability. It even worked for me in the short term because it allowed me to avoid a conversation I wasn't ready to have. Normalization is powerful that way. Once something becomes routine, it stops registering as a problem. You stop measuring it against what you were promised and start measuring it against what you've come to expect. The disrespect wasn't loud, it was procedural. A missed appointment here, a delayed response there, a habit of asking after instead of being present during. I told myself not to keep score, that love wasn't transactional, that we were on the same side even if we weren't always in the same room. But my body knew before my mind did. There was a tightening in my chest every time I saw couples together at the clinic. A small flare of anger I dismissed as envy. A fatigue that didn't match my sleep schedule. I began to feel like the IVF process belonged to me alone, even though the outcome was supposed to belong to us. And still, I stayed quiet. I stayed quiet because I believed in context, because I understood pressure, because I didn't want to be the reason this already difficult journey became emotionally heavier. What I didn't yet see was that I was already carrying the emotional weight alone. My silence wasn't protecting the process. It was protecting his comfort. Disrespect, when repeated and unchallenged, stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like the environment. You stop asking whether it's acceptable and start asking how to live inside it. By the end of this phase, I no longer expected him to show up unless explicitly required. And even then, I prepared for the possibility that he wouldn't. That preparation felt like maturity. In reality, it was resignation wearing a calm expression. I didn't realize I'd been assigned a role until I noticed how uncomfortable people became when I stepped outside of it. By then, the version of me everyone interacted with was already fully formed, competent, composed, uncomplaining. The one who handled things, the one who didn't need reassurance, the one who would let you know if something was wrong. That last assumption did most of the damage, because it allowed everyone, especially my husband, to believe that silence meant stability. In our marriage, my role was the stabilizer, the emotional regulator. If something needed planning, I planned it. If something went wrong, I absorbed the disruption. If there was tension, I smoothed it out before it could harden into conflict. I was reliable in a way that made others feel safe without requiring their participation. And once a role like that solidifies, people begin to depend on it. Not consciously, not maliciously, but completely. They stop checking in, they stop offering, they stop noticing. During IVF, this role intensified. I was the patient who showed up prepared, the spouse who didn't demand presence, the woman who could be trusted to handle disappointment quietly. Medical staff spoke to me as if I were navigating the process solo, and I let them. It felt easier than explaining an absence that had no dramatic explanation. At home, my husband treated IVF updates the way he treated weather reports. Informational, neutral, something to be aware of, but not something that requires emotional adjustment. He trusted me to manage it, and I trusted myself not to ask for more. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when I tried to step outside the role. It was after a particularly difficult monitoring appointment. The doctor had adjusted the protocol. Nothing catastrophic, but not encouraging either. That evening, while we were eating dinner, I said, carefully, "Today was harder than I expected." He looked up, surprised, not by the difficulty, but by my admission. "Oh," he said, "but you're okay, right?" There it was, the role checking itself. If I said yes, everything could continue as usual. If I said no, I would be introducing friction. I would be redefining myself in a way that required a response. I said, "I will be." And just like that, I stepped back into position. That exchange taught me something important. My role wasn't just assigned by him. It was reinforced by my willingness to maintain it. I had become useful in a very specific way. I made things easier by making myself smaller, by translating pain into palatable summaries, by ensuring that no one else had to sit with uncertainty. Reliable, capable, invisible. Those qualities are celebrated in theory. In practice, they often become expectations. No one sat down and decided this was who I should be. It emerged naturally, built from patterns that went unchallenged. And once it was established, deviating from it felt like breaking a rule I had never agreed to, but was somehow responsible for upholding. I began to see how people reacted when I didn't perform the role perfectly. Confusion, discomfort, subtle irritation, as if I had violated an unspoken contract. It became clear that my value, in their eyes, was tied to my consistency, not my experience. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way. I understood then that I wasn't being supported because I wasn't perceived as someone who required support. I had taught them that lesson over time through competence and restraint. And roles like that don't dissolve on their own. They only change when the person playing them decides to stop. At this point in the story, I hadn't made that decision yet, but I had finally named the role I was in. Once you see it, you can't pretend it isn't there. The shift didn't happen on a dramatic day. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where everything suddenly became clear. It happened on a morning that looked, from the outside, exactly like all the others. I was scheduled for an early monitoring appointment, blood work and ultrasound. Routine by that point. I had told my husband about it the night before, not because I expected him to come, but out of habit. He had nodded, distracted, already thinking about something else. That morning, I didn't remind him. I noticed that first. I woke up, got dressed, prepared my bag, and realized, almost with curiosity, that I had made a quiet decision not to ask, not to check, not to hope. The clinic was cold in the way medical buildings often are, bright and impersonal, designed to keep things moving efficiently. I checked in. I sat down. I watched other couples arrive together, whispering, holding coffee cups, touching shoulders in small, grounding ways. I felt nothing sharp, just distant. When my name was called, I followed the nurse down the hallway alone. The ultrasound room was dim, the lights intentionally soft. The technician greeted me kindly and professionally and began the process. Halfway through, she paused to take notes. "Is your partner joining you later today?" she asked without looking up. I answered automatically, "No." The word landed differently than I expected. Not heavy, not sad, just final. She nodded and continued. No awkwardness, no pity. The room returned to its quiet hum. And in that moment, something inside me settled. I realized I wasn't disappointed anymore. That was the shift. Disappointment requires expectation. Hope, the belief that things might be otherwise. What I felt instead was clarity, calm, steady, and slightly detached. On the drive home, I noticed details I usually rushed past. The way the city was just waking up. The way the morning light hit the buildings. The absence of urgency in my own body. I wasn't bracing for anything. At home, my husband was still there, scrolling on his phone, coffee untouched on the counter. He looked up when I walked in. "Oh, you're back already?" "Yes," I said. "How did it go?" I gave him the facts. Adjustments, next steps. The tone was neutral, almost clinical. He listened, nodded, said, "Okay," and went back to his screen. And I felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt, not even sadness. Just a quiet recognition. This is how it is. That recognition didn't make me feel small. It made me still. For the first time since starting IVF, I stopped mentally translating my experience into something shareable. I stopped preparing explanations. I stopped wondering whether he should be here, whether he would notice, and whether I should ask again. I understood something important that day. I wasn't being abandoned in a dramatic sense. I was being left alone in increments small enough to accept, until I no longer questioned them. And I was complicit. Not out of weakness, but out of endurance. The shift was internal. I didn't announce it. I didn't confront him. I didn't even consciously decide what would come next. I simply stopped compensating. That afternoon, when the clinic called with results, I took the call alone and didn't summarize it later. That evening, when he asked casually how I was feeling, I said, fine, and meant it in a way he wouldn't understand. Fine no longer meant handling everything. It meant no longer reaching. I began to see how much emotional labor I had been doing behind the scenes, connecting dots, softening absences, maintaining the illusion of partnership, and how quiet it felt when I stopped. That day didn't change my circumstances. It changed my posture. I was still polite, still calm, still present, but something essential had withdrawn. Not in protest, in acceptance. And once you accept a reality without trying to fix it, your options begin to reorganize themselves. I didn't know yet what I would do with that clarity. I only knew that something irreversible had begun, not outwardly, but internally. And no one noticed. At first, the silence felt like relief. Not the kind that comes from resolution, but the kind that follows surrender. When you stop expecting someone to meet you where they've never stood before, the emotional noise fades. The constant internal negotiations end. You no longer rehearse conversations that won't happen. I didn't announce my withdrawal. I didn't change my behavior in obvious ways. I simply stopped offering more than was asked. And that made all the difference. Before, my silence had been endurance, holding things in so the process wouldn't feel heavier, so my husband wouldn't feel pressured, so our marriage could remain intact on the surface. Now, silence became a decision, a boundary so quiet it looked like compliance. I noticed how little anyone needed from me once I stopped filling in the gaps. I still attended every appointment. I still followed every instruction. IVF didn't pause just because my expectations had shifted, but I stopped narrating it. I stopped translating medical language into emotional context. I stopped creating bridges no one had asked to cross. My husband didn't object. In fact, he seemed more relaxed. There were fewer conversations, fewer updates, fewer moments where he had to consider rearranging his day. He assumed this meant things were easier, that I was managing well. And I let him believe that. Silence is often mistaken for strength, but there's a subtler misunderstanding that happens when silence is chosen. It's mistaken for permission. He didn't ask if I wanted company at appointments anymore. He didn't ask how I was feeling unless something visibly disrupted the routine. He interpreted my calm as confirmation that his level of involvement was sufficient. From his perspective, nothing was wrong. From mine, everything had clarified. I began to observe rather than participate. Not in a detached way, but in a deliberate one. I paid attention to patterns, to what he noticed and what he didn't, to how quickly absence becomes normalized when no one names it. I learned how rarely people question systems that continue to function. At work, I had seen this countless times. Processes held together by one person's quiet labor go unnoticed until that labor stops. But in my marriage, I was seeing it from the inside. I also noticed something else. When I stopped asking for presence, I stopped feeling rejected by its absence. That was unexpected. Rejection requires engagement, hope, the possibility of a different outcome. Absence, once accepted, loses its sting and becomes information. And information is power if you know how to use it. I started to conserve energy. Not dramatically, not visibly, but intentionally. I rested more. I journaled privately. I documented appointments, conversations, and timelines. Not with an agenda, just with accuracy. Clarity doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. There were moments when he sensed the shift, though he couldn't name it. He'd ask, "You're quiet lately. Everything okay?" And I would answer honestly, yes. Because it was. Not happy, not resolved, but aligned. My silence was no longer an attempt to keep the peace. It was a reflection of reality as it was, not as I wished it to be. What he didn't understand was that silence, once chosen, changes the trajectory of things. It creates space, not for reconciliation, but for evaluation. I was no longer waiting for him to show up. I was watching what happened when he didn't. And in that observation, something steady and unshakable began to form. Not anger, not resentment, just readiness. By the end of this phase, my silence was complete enough that it no longer required effort. It wasn't suppression, it was precision. I hadn't moved yet, but I had stopped standing still for someone else. What they never noticed was how much preparation can happen in complete stillness. From the outside, nothing about my life appeared to change. I went to work. I came home. I followed the IVF protocol with the same discipline I always had. I spoke calmly. I smiled when appropriate. I didn't withdraw socially or create visible distance. That's the illusion people trust the most, the appearance of continuity. Inside, however, something else was underway. Once silence became intentional, observation sharpened. I stopped reacting emotionally and started recording reality as it was, not as I wanted it to be. I noticed what happened when I didn't remind him of appointments, when I didn't preemptively explain my moods, when I didn't cushion his absence with understanding. Nothing collapsed. That was the first data point. Life didn't become harder for him. It became smoother. and that told me something I hadn't been ready to admit before. My emotional labor had been insulating him from consequences. So I stopped insulating. I began documenting things, not obsessively, not suspiciously, but accurately. Appointment dates, conversations. Who was present, who wasn't, what was promised, what was followed through. I didn't frame these notes as evidence at the time. They were simply records, neutral, factual, unemotional. Facts don't require justification. I also began educating myself quietly. About IVF outcomes, yes, but also about marriage, finances, and personal agency. I read about how people disentangle lives that have been woven together carefully over the years. I learned what options exist before anyone feels desperate enough to ask. Knowledge is a form of leverage, even when you don't yet know how you'll use it. At work, I was still the same person, efficient, composed, reliable. But I noticed how often people mistook consistency for permanence. How rarely does anyone ask whether the person holding everything together intends to keep doing so indefinitely? That awareness carried into my personal life. My husband never asked if I was okay being alone through this process. He asked if I was okay in general. And because I answered yes, he took that as confirmation that his absence had no cost. He didn't see the shift because he didn't know what to look for. People expect distance to announce itself loudly. Arguments, ultimatums, emotional volatility. When none of that appears, they assume stability. But quiet withdrawal doesn't look like conflict. It looks like cooperation. I still did what was required. I just stopped doing what was optional. I stopped initiating conversations about the future. I stopped filling the silence with reassurance. I stopped making plans that required emotional alignment we no longer had. He didn't push back. That was the second data point. I realized then that my presence had been carrying more emotional weight than I understood. And when I began to redistribute that weight back to where it belonged, nothing replaced it. There were moments when I almost said something, when I considered explaining what I was noticing, what I was learning, how the silence had changed from patience to assessment. But I didn't. Because I wasn't trying to fix anything anymore. I was trying to understand it, and understanding requires stillness. The IVF process continued. Results came and went. Adjustments were made. I absorbed disappointment without sharing it. I carried hope without advertising it. The solitude of it was no longer shocking. It was instructive. Absence teaches you exactly where you stand. I also noticed how my body responded to this phase. I slept better. My thoughts were clearer. I wasn't constantly bracing for emotional letdown because I had stopped expecting emotional presence. Expectation is often the source of pain, not absence itself. What they never noticed was that I was no longer emotionally invested in being understood. I didn't need validation. I didn't need acknowledgement. I needed clarity, and I had it. By the end of this part of the story, I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't even sad in the way people expect sadness to look. I was positioned with information, positioned with calm, positioned with the quiet confidence that comes from seeing the full picture without distortion. Preparation doesn't require secrecy. It requires patience. And patience had always been my strongest skill. They mistook it for compliance. The reveal didn't come from a confrontation. It came from a pattern that finally completed itself. By that point, I wasn't searching for answers anymore. I wasn't asking why things were the way they were. I was simply watching what happened when nothing interfered, when no one softened edges or filled emotional gaps on my behalf. And what revealed itself was not cruelty. It was something quieter and in many ways more final. Indifference, comfortably sustained. One evening, several weeks into another IVF cycle, I came home later than usual. The clinic had run behind schedule, and the delay had drained me more than the appointment itself. Not physically, emotionally. Waiting rooms do that. They stretch time and shrink perspective. When I walked in, my husband was already eating dinner. He looked up, smiled briefly, and said, "Oh, I didn't know you'd be late." I realized then that I hadn't told him where I was. Not because I was hiding it, but because I no longer thought to share it. "I had an appointment," I said. "Oh," he replied, "everything okay?" "Yes." That answer had become precise. It meant nothing requires your involvement. He nodded and returned to his plate, and in that small, unremarkable exchange, the final piece clicked into place. I saw it clearly, not emotionally but structurally. My pain did not disrupt his life. My absence from the room did not register. My presence was not required for intimacy. My struggle existed parallel to his routine, not within it. He wasn't avoiding me. He wasn't dismissing me deliberately. He simply had no internal mechanism that prompted him to step toward discomfort that wasn't immediately visible. He supported ideas. He supported outcomes. He did not support processes. And IVF is nothing but a process. That was the reveal. Not that he didn't love me in his own way, but that the version of partnership I needed existed outside his capacity or willingness to engage. I didn't feel devastated by this realization. I felt steady. Because clarity, once reached, has a strange calming effect. It ends the internal debate. It removes the emotional static. I stopped wondering whether I was asking for too much. I wasn't asking at all. I also stopped framing this as a failure on either side. There was no villain to expose, no moral high ground to claim, just a mismatch that had been masked for years by my adaptability. Adaptability can hide incompatibility for a very long time. In private, I began to test this clarity, not by provoking, but by withholding effort. I didn't remind him of upcoming procedures that required emotional support. I didn't signal when days were particularly heavy. I didn't perform resilience for reassurance. And still, nothing shifted. That was the confirmation. People often believe that if something truly matters, it will eventually be noticed. What they don't understand is that some systems are designed to function without feedback. My marriage had become one of those systems. The reveal wasn't dramatic enough to share with anyone else. If I had told a friend, it would have sounded vague, subjective, easy to explain away. He's just stressed. He doesn't know how to show it. You should tell him what you need. But I had told him, over time, in tone, in context, in opportunity. I had told him by showing up fully and waiting to be met halfway. The private reveal was this. I was already alone in the ways that mattered. The legal paperwork, the shared address, the routine conversations, they created the appearance of togetherness. But emotional presence had been optional for him, and therefore absent when inconvenient. That understanding didn't make me feel rejected. It made me feel relieved, released from hoping he would change, released from translating my needs, released from waiting for recognition that would never arrive on its own. I didn't act on this revelation immediately. I didn't confront him. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't alter the household dynamic. I simply accepted that I was the only one emotionally invested in sustaining the illusion of partnership. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. From that moment on, every interaction confirmed the same truth. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He just wasn't present in the way my life required. The reveal didn't end the marriage. It ended my uncertainty. And that was enough. Clarity creates a strange kind of pressure. Not urgency, not panic, but inevitability. Once I accepted what the marriage actually was, not what it was supposed to be, not what it looked like from the outside, I reached a point where not deciding became its own decision. I remember sitting alone one evening, the apartment quiet in a way that no longer felt temporary. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't rehearsing arguments. I was simply reviewing options, the way I would at work when faced with a complex system that needed restructuring. What were my choices? I could stay exactly where I was. That was the first option. Continue the marriage as it functions now. Handle IVF alone. Maintain the appearance of partnership. Absorb disappointment privately. There was no immediate crisis forcing change. This option was stable, predictable, and emotionally sustainable in the short term. But I understood its cost. It required shrinking indefinitely. The second option was to confront him, to explain, clearly and directly, what his absence had cost me, to ask, explicitly, for presence, support, engagement, to renegotiate the terms of our partnership. This option appealed to the part of me that valued fairness, transparency, the belief that people deserve the opportunity to respond when they've caused harm, but I also understood the risk. Confrontation would require me to teach him how to show up in a way that by now should have been intuitive. It would require ongoing monitoring, reminders, emotional translation. And if he agreed but didn't follow through, the disappointment would no longer be abstract. It would be active, repeated, harder to absorb. The third option was to step back, not dramatically, not publicly, but deliberately. To stop organizing my life around a partnership that existed mostly on paper. To begin preparing for a future that didn't rely on his emotional availability. This option felt irreversible. Once you stop centering someone in your decisions, you can't pretend otherwise. Once you shift from we to I, the relationship changes, whether or not you announce it. I sat with these options longer than I expected. Not because the answer was unclear, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't acting out of temporary fatigue. IVF is exhausting. Marriage can be exhausting. I didn't want to confuse depletion with conviction, so I waited. I watched myself over several weeks. I paid attention to how my body reacted to each imagined path. When I pictured staying, my chest tightened, not with fear, but with resignation. When I pictured confronting him, I felt tired before the conversation even began. When I pictured stepping back, I felt calm. Not relieved, not triumphant, just settled. That was how I knew. The decision wasn't to leave immediately. It wasn't to end things with a single conversation or a dramatic exit. It was quieter than that. I decided to stop investing emotionally in a structure that required my silence to function. That decision was irreversible, even if its consequences weren't immediate. I didn't stop caring. I stopped hoping. And hope, I realized, had been the most draining part of all. From that point forward, I made choices that prioritized clarity over comfort. I redirected energy inward. I prepared, logistically, financially, emotionally, for independence without framing it as escape. This wasn't about punishment or withdrawal. It was about alignment. I didn't tell him I had reached this decision. Not yet. Decisions like this don't need witnesses to be real. They only need consistency. He noticed that I seemed calmer, more self-contained, less reactive. He interpreted this as things improving. In a way, they had. For me, the decision point wasn't marked by an argument or a declaration. It was marked by a shift in orientation, from waiting to moving, from enduring to choosing. And once that shift happens, everything that follows becomes a matter of timing, not doubt. Once the decision was made, movement didn't look like motion. It looked like a restraint. I didn't change my tone. I didn't change my routines in ways anyone could point to. I continued the IVF process as planned, attended work, came home at the same time, spoke politely, and asked about his day. From the outside, nothing had shifted. Inside, everything had. Moving in silence meant doing only what was necessary, and nothing extra to preserve an illusion that no longer served me. I began with the practical things, quietly, methodically. I reviewed our finances, not with suspicion, but with clarity. I learned exactly what was shared and what was not, which accounts were joint, which obligations were mutual, which documents mattered. I didn't rush, I didn't panic. I simply made sure I understood my position without relying on assumptions. Knowledge removes fear. I updated my personal records, secured copies of documents that belonged to me, reviewed timelines and policies I had ignored before because I trusted permanence. Trust is efficient, preparation is wiser. I also began adjusting my emotional investments. I stopped framing future plans in plural language, at least internally. When I thought about the next year, the next 5, the next version of my life, I did so without automatically placing him at the center. That shift was subtle, but powerful. I noticed how often people unconsciously build their decisions around someone else's comfort. I had done that for years. Now I began to ask a different question. What makes my life sustainable? That question guided everything. At home, he didn't notice the recalibration. Why would he? My presence had never required active engagement from him. I was still there, still functional, still calm. Silence is disarming that way. I stopped initiating intimacy that required emotional attunement, not out of spite, but out of honesty. I didn't pretend closeness where there wasn't any. I let the space exist without trying to fill it. He interpreted this as maturity, independence, perhaps even strength. People often misread withdrawal as stability when it's done quietly. The IVF cycle progressed. Results arrived. Adjustments were made. I absorbed information without commentary. When things were difficult, I managed them privately. When things were hopeful, I held that hope carefully, without sharing it prematurely. Hope, I had learned, is safest when it isn't dependent on someone else's presence. I also paid attention to timing. There's a difference between acting and moving too soon. I wasn't trying to shock anyone. I wasn't seeking relief through rupture. I was positioning myself so that when action became necessary, it would not be reactive. That meant waiting. Waiting without stagnation. Waiting while building quiet certainty. He began to sense something. Not wrong exactly, but different. He'd ask occasionally, "You seem very focused lately." I would smile and say, I am. And I was. Focused on preserving my dignity. Focused on protecting my future. Focused on not asking someone to become who they had already shown me they weren't. Moving in silence is not about secrecy. It's about minimizing noise while you realign your center of gravity. By the end of this phase, my life was no longer balanced around his availability. It was balanced around my capacity. That shift didn't require permission. It didn't require explanation. It only required consistency. And consistency, as it turns out, is something I've always been very good at. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They emerge quietly, in the negative space left behind when something stops compensating for imbalance. I didn't change anything outwardly, but the system had already begun to shift. Without my constant emotional scaffolding, small disruptions started to surface. Nothing dramatic, nothing he could immediately trace back to a cause. He noticed it first in absence, not in conflict. Conversations felt shorter, not colder, just incomplete. Moments that once flowed smoothly now ended earlier than expected, like a sentence missing its final clause. He'd ask about my day, and I'd answer accurately but briefly. No embellishment, no emotional translation. When he spoke about his work, I listened politely but did not expand the discussion. I wasn't withdrawing affection. I was putting in effort. And effort is often mistaken for personality, until it's gone. He began to feel something he couldn't name. A subtle unease, a sense that things were less connected, less anchored. He didn't confront it directly. He tried to correct it indirectly, suggesting dinner plans, commenting on how busy we'd both been, making small gestures that didn't require presence when it mattered. From his perspective, he was responding. From mine, he was reacting to loss without understanding its source. I watched this with a kind of distant attentiveness. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just observation. This was the natural result of a system no longer being quietly managed by one person. The IVF process continued, and its emotional weight began to surface in unexpected ways. When I no longer preemptively reassured him, he started asking more questions, not about how I felt, but about outcomes, timelines, probabilities. He sensed stakes, but not experience. One evening, after I returned from another appointment alone, he asked, "Is there something I should be doing differently?" It was the first time he had come close to naming the gap. I looked at him and felt something surprisingly neutral. Not anger, not relief, just the awareness that this question was arriving very late. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I've been handling it." That answer unsettled him more than any accusation would have, because it didn't invite reassurance. It didn't invite explanation. It didn't invite repair. It simply stated reality. From that point on, he began to feel the loss of access, not to me physically, but emotionally. He didn't know what I was thinking unless I chose to tell him. He didn't know what I was carrying unless it surfaced incidentally. The assumption of transparency had dissolved. And assumptions, once broken, don't quietly return. He became more attentive in ways that were safe, checking in verbally, asking if I needed anything, offering support in abstract terms. But he didn't step into the spaces that required vulnerability or discomfort. And I didn't guide him there. This was the consequence he hadn't anticipated. The cost of absence isn't confrontation, it's distance. And distance doesn't argue, it just grows. Friends and family still saw us as stable, functional, calm. They didn't notice the shift because it wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no public signs of strain. But inside the marriage, the atmosphere had changed. Not tense, just think. The emotional buffer I had provided was gone, and he could feel the draft. I didn't feel powerful watching this unfold. I felt clear. This wasn't a lesson I was teaching him. It was a reality he was finally encountering without my intervention. Consequences, when delayed, often feel unfair to the person experiencing them. He hadn't changed his behavior significantly. Why then did things feel different? The answer was simple, though unspoken. I had. And once that shift occurs, the environment responds accordingly. This phase wasn't about punishment or exposure. It was about allowing cause and effect to operate without interference. And for the first time, he was living inside the emotional conditions I had been navigating alone for months. By the time he realized something was wrong, he was already responding to an outcome, not a problem. That's the quiet cruelty of delayed awareness. When you finally notice the distance, you assume it appeared recently. You don't realize it's been forming for months, maybe years, while someone else was compensating for it. His concern became more visible then. He started asking questions with urgency in them, not accusations, confusion. He asked if I was stressed, if IVF was taking more out of me than I was admitting, if work was overwhelming. He searched for an external cause, something manageable, something that could be adjusted without challenging the foundation. He never asked if he was part of the problem. That omission mattered more than anything else. There was a night when he sat beside me on the couch, closer than usual, as if proximity itself could restore something intangible. He said, "I feel like you've been pulling away." I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it either. "I've been focusing," I said. "On what?" he asked. Stand. My first instinct was to protect him from the answer. Not because I still felt responsible for his comfort, but because I understood that telling him the truth now would only create panic, not change. So I chose precision over explanation. "On what I need," I said. That was when I saw it, the subtle shift from confusion to fear, not dramatic fear, practical fear. The kind that comes when someone senses they may be losing access to something they assumed was permanent. He tried to compensate. He offered to come to the next appointment. He suggested time off. He asked how he could help more. The language was well-intentioned, but it framed presence as a task to be assigned rather than a choice to be made. And timing matters. Presence offered after distance has already settled, doesn't feel like support. It feels like a correction. I realized then that nothing he could do in that moment would undo what had already happened. Not because he was incapable, but because I was no longer open to being convinced. Repair requires trust that effort will be sustained, not activated only when consequences appear. I listened to him carefully. I watched how quickly his concern escalated once he felt the ground shift beneath him. And I understood something with painful clarity. He wasn't responding to my pain. He was responding to my withdrawal. That distinction closed the door quietly but permanently. There was no satisfaction in this realization, no sense of victory, just a sober acknowledgement that we were no longer aligned in time. He was arriving emotionally at a place I had passed through months ago. I had grieved already. I had already. His sudden urgency couldn't reach me because I wasn't standing where he thought I was. When someone asks how to fix something after you've already let go of the expectation that it will be fixed, the answer becomes impossible to articulate. Anything you say sounds either too harsh or too vague. So I said very little. I told him I needed space, not to punish, not to test, but because space had already become my reality, and I wasn't willing to pretend otherwise. He didn't argue. He didn't protest loudly. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing information that didn't match his internal timeline. Panic, when it arrives late, is quiet. He tried to be present in ways he could measure, checking in more often, adjusting his schedule, offering reassurance. But reassurance only works when you're still asking for it. I wasn't. This was the moment when reversal became inevitable. Not because I wanted it to be, but because momentum had already shifted direction. Too late doesn't mean impossible in theory. It means impossible in practice. Not everything can be repaired just because someone finally wants to try. Some things depend on timing, and timing is not negotiable. By the end of this phase, he was trying to save something that, for me, no longer needed saving. And I was no longer willing to pretend that effort alone could replace presence that had been absent when it mattered most. When the conversation finally happened, it didn't feel like a confrontation. There was no surge of adrenaline, no rehearsed speeches, no emotional release waiting on the other side. It happened on an ordinary evening, after dinner, when the apartment was quiet and there was nowhere to rush to. He asked if we could talk. His voice was careful, as if volume itself might determine the outcome. I agreed. We sat across from each other, not close, not distant, just two people occupying the same space with different timelines. He spoke first. He told me he felt like he was losing me. Those things had changed, that he didn't understand when or how. He said he wished I had told him sooner. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he waited, for reassurance, I think, or explanation, something to re-anchor him. What he got instead was honesty. Delivered without heat. I did tell you, I said, just not all at once. He frowned slightly. I don't remember that. I know, I said. That's part of it. I didn't list missed appointments. I didn't recite dates or moments. I didn't argue about intention. None of that mattered anymore. I needed you to show up without being asked, I continued. Not perfectly, not every time, but consistently enough that I didn't feel alone in something that was supposed to belong to both of us. He started to speak, but I held up a hand gently, not to stop him, but to slow the moment. I'm not angry, I said, and I'm not saying you didn't care. I'm saying that caring from a distance didn't reach me anymore. That landed. He looked down, processing. He said he thought giving me space was respecting my strength, that he trusted me to handle things, that he assumed I would tell him if it was too much. I did, I said quietly, by how long I waited. There was no accusation in my voice, just a fact. I told him that at some point, I stopped expecting him to be there. I learned how to carry the process alone, and that something changed inside me when that happened. He asked, then, the question people ask when they sense finality approaching. Is there anything I can do now? I considered it carefully. This was the moment people expected anger, or ultimatums, or dramatic honesty meant to wound. What he got instead was clarity. I don't want to rebuild something by teaching you how to notice me, I said. And I don't want to go back to hoping you'll show up if I explain myself better. The room was very quiet. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just sat with it. And I could see him understanding, slowly, that this wasn't a conversation about trying harder. It was a conversation about timing. I wasn't closing the door out of spite. I was acknowledging that I had already walked through it emotionally, months ago. I'm not asking you to change, I added. I'm telling you that I already have. That was the closest thing to a confrontation there was. No raised voices, no tears, no dramatic exit. Just two people recognizing that the version of us that once existed couldn't be recovered by effort alone. We ended the conversation calmly, respectfully. Nothing was resolved that night in a logistical sense, but something had ended cleanly. And that clean ending mattered because it meant I didn't carry resentment forward. I carried understanding. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was then. I didn't become colder. I didn't become harder. I didn't lose my capacity for care. What changed was direction. After that conversation, things unfolded quietly. There were decisions to be made, timelines to respect, and logistics to handle. We approached those things the same way we had approached most of our marriage, calmly, efficiently, without drama. That consistency made it easier for others to understand, even if they didn't know the full story. But internally, I was already somewhere else. I no longer measured myself by how well I could endure. I no longer confused silence with strength or adaptability with love. I stopped believing that being easy to live with was the same as being valued. Who I am now is someone who pays attention to presence. Not declarations, not intentions, not potential. Presence. I notice who shows up without being prompted, who sits in discomfort rather than avoiding it, who treats shared experiences as shared responsibilities, not individual burdens. That awareness didn't make me cynical, it made me precise. In the months that followed, I learned how different life feels when you stop overfunctioning emotionally, when you let silence reveal rather than conceal, when you stop narrating your pain in a way that makes it palatable for others. I didn't need to harden myself to do that. I just needed to stop editing. There were moments when grief surfaced, not sharply, but gently. Grief for the version of myself who believed patience would eventually be met with reciprocity. Grief for the years spent mistaking stability for connection. But grief, when acknowledged, doesn't linger destructively. It clarifies. I also noticed something unexpected. My capacity for intimacy hadn't diminished. It had become more selective. I didn't offer it automatically. I didn't pour it into spaces that couldn't hold it. That selectivity felt like self-respect. IVF taught me many things, but not all of them were about biology. It taught me how profoundly vulnerable you become when your body and future are involved, and how important it is that the people closest to you understand that vulnerability not as weakness, but as something that deserves presence. I didn't regret trying. I didn't regret hoping. I didn't regret loving someone in the best way I knew how at the time. Regret implies error. What I experienced was learning. Who I am now is someone who doesn't need to announce boundaries for them to exist. I don't negotiate for attention. I don't interpret absence generously at my own expense. I let reality speak, and I listen. That listening has changed the way I move through the world. At work, in friendships, in every space where I once felt responsible for maintaining equilibrium. I still value calm. I still value steadiness. But I no longer confuse them with self-erasure. If someone looks at my life now, they might still describe me the same way they always have. Composed, capable, quietly strong. The difference is that now, those qualities serve me, not the other way around. I didn't walk away from that marriage with bitterness. I walked away with alignment. And alignment, I've learned, is the quietest form of power. There's a lesson people often want at the end of stories like this. Something clean, something instructive. A clear line that tells you what to do if you ever find yourself in the same position. But real life doesn't offer lessons that neatly. What it offers instead is understanding. Earned slowly, sometimes painfully, often in silence. If there's one truth I carried out of this experience, it's this. Absence hurts more than rejection. Rejection is direct. It forces a reckoning. It tells you where you stand. Absence lets you stand in the same place indefinitely, waiting for something that never quite arrives, questioning your own expectations instead of the reality in front of you. I wasn't rejected loudly. I wasn't abandoned dramatically. I was simply left alone in something that required two people. And for a long time, I told myself that enduring that quietly was strength. What I learned is that strength without reciprocity becomes erasure. No one wakes up one day and decides to disappear from a relationship. It happens incrementally, through missed moments, deferred presence, and the assumption that someone else will keep carrying the weight because they always have. The danger isn't cruelty, it's comfort. Comfort allows absence to feel justified. It allows people to believe that intention counts as action, that support in theory is the same as support in practice. It isn't. What I didn't do, and what I don't regret not doing, is begging to be seen. I didn't issue ultimatums. I didn't raise my voice to prove my pain was real. I didn't suffer to make it undeniable. Instead, I let reality continue without my intervention. And reality revealed the truth more clearly than any confrontation could have. This story isn't meant to make you distrust love or question commitment. It's meant to remind you that partnership is not measured by words or plans, but by presence, especially when things are uncomfortable, inconvenient, or emotionally demanding. If you're the one who always adjusts, always understands, always waits, ask yourself this gently. What would happen if you stopped compensating? Not to punish anyone, not to test them, just to see what remains when you step back. Sometimes what remains is enough, sometimes it isn't, and neither outcome makes you wrong. Quiet dominance isn't about winning, it's about choosing alignment over endurance, dignity over explanation, clarity over hope that has already overstayed its welcome. I didn't leave that chapter of my life angry, I left it awake. And that awareness, once gained, doesn't fade. If this story resonated with you, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll answer it honestly in the comments. Have you ever realized that you were carrying a relationship alone only after you stopped trying to hold it together? Your answers matter, not for judgment, not for comparison, but because naming these experiences out loud is often the first step toward no longer repeating them. Thank you for listening.